Hi, everybody. This is Tim Guy here to talk about my research paper, a summary of the mathematic game research. Basically, what I did was I looked at a research article where these researchers took a group of middle schoolers from an urban environment and did a study where they gave them this math facts video game. And the game, they kept the same through the kind of questions they were getting, but what they do is they changed the format of the game to see basically how the different formats of the game would affect student motivation, affect their learning outcomes, and their performance during the game. So the three different kind of formats that they tried were collaborative, competitive, and individual. So they either had students competing against each other, they had them working with each other, or they just had them work on their own. So they went ahead and they did this research and got kind of scores from the students. And what they kind of found was that both collaborative and the competitive showed some improvement in student motivation, learning, and performance. What was weird, though, is that when they kind of went into the research, they kind of felt that collaborative would be the best because previous research has shown that to be better than competitive. But their research kind of had competitive coming out a little bit ahead in some of the different categories. So what they decided was that for the future, they suggested to have competitive games be more the default for future academic. I wrote video games, but just sort of online games or just sort of electronic games for them to practice with. Now, in my paper, I went into a little bit about that decision and kind of decided that that conclusion might not be the best conclusion for these researchers to make. There were some issues with their study, mainly with some of their sample of students. They only did urban students, which it's hard to extrapolate that specific a population to the entire, country of students that we teach. So I didn't think that that was necessarily a fair thing to do. It's not a good random sample for anybody who's into statistics. And then also there's mismatch with the previous research. So a lot of other research has talked about the power of collaborative. And while competitive can be a positive social interdependence, which we'll talk about in a second, just throwing out previous research based off one study might not be the best thing to do. Why did I pick this topic? So in my school, we have a one-to-one classroom. So all of my students have an electronic device, specifically an iPad. So we incorporate in my classroom a lot of these sort of electronic activities and games, such as Kahoot, Nearpod, quizzes. There's a lot of different things that we use. And because I incorporate those group activities, I'm always looking for which ones are going to be the best for building grit and determination. I find that student motivation can be one of the hardest things, especially with middle school math. A lot of students just are not motivated to put their full effort into middle school math, and I'm always looking for which ways I can build that grit in the students. So what did I learn by reading this is really that both collaborative and competitive can build grit. A lot of research out there talks about collaborative, but this research definitely showed that competitive has a place as well. A lot of the students who did the competitive game were performing better than some of the other students who were getting really, really good at answering these math facts. I also, one of the things they looked at was whether students would suggest it to their friends to play. And basically the competitive and collaborative both had a high rate of student suggestion while the individual did not. And it just kind of reaffirms some of my thoughts about how when students work together in activities, whether it be collaborative or competitive, those tend to be things that students are more motivated to do than when you just have them work on something individually. And in math, that can be really difficult sometimes because math tends to be sort of an isolated individual subject sometimes. So kind of looking for ways to kind of reformat some of those lessons and make them collaborative is really important. Some of the connections that are built into the course. The whole point of my paper was about building grit. So Angela Duckworth's TED Talk about grit, determination. How do you build that student who wants to learn and is willing to do whatever it takes to learn? And kind of this was attacking that idea of how do we build grit that she kind of brought up, and how do we get that in our students? Another thing is that really from their conclusions, they kind of said motivation is just really hard. It's a very complex topic, and that's something that Dr. Deemer really talked about in the first chapter, is that motivation is complex. It's an individual by individual basis. We have things that we can look at to help us make conclusions on that, but it's really hard to do. And last but not least, the whole the whole way that this content was draped was by social interdependence. Basically, looking at the social interdependence theory, whether it's a collaborative or a competitive way that you're implementing the game, it needs to be positive social interaction between students, and it kind of all fits back into that article we read from Johnson about the social interdependence theory. So that was my research paper. Hopefully you got a good overview here, and it was great having class with everybody.